At 790,000 years ago, first use of fire by home minds. At 700,000 years ago, both humans and Neanderthal lineages starts to diverge genetically. At 680,000 to 620,000 years ago, the Nebraskan glacial period. At 640,000 years ago, another Yellowstone supervolcanic eruption. At 530,000 years ago, the development of Heidelberg. At 455,000 to 300,000 years ago, the Kansan glacial period. At 400,000 years ago, hominids hunt with wooden spears. At 370,000 years ago, humans and Neanderthals are fully separated populations. At 300,000 years ago, hominids routinely use controlled fires. At 230,000 years ago, Neanderthals spreads throughout Europe. At 200,000 to 130,000 years ago, the Illinoisan glacial period. At 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens appeared. At 125,000 years ago, Amian stage. At 110,000 years ago, start of Wisconsin glacial period. At 105,000 years ago, the Stone Age humans foraged. At 80,000 years ago, the non-African humans interbred with Neanderthals. At 74,000 years ago, the Toby volcanic eruption occurred. At 71,000 years ago, the invention of the bow and arrow. At 70,000 years ago, Thartabo glacial maximum covers Canada and northern US. At 55,000 years ago, humans colonize Australia. At 46,000 years ago, megafauna die off. At 40,000 years ago, Cro-Magnon man appeared in Europe. Zooming the timeline really close now. At 28,000 years ago, Neanderthals disappears from the fossil record. At 26,500 years ago, the Taupo supervolcanic eruption in New Zealand. At 22,000 years ago, the Tioga glacial maximum and sea level was 130 meters lower. At 20,000 years ago, the invention of fired ceramic pottery. At 19,000 years ago, the Antarctic sea starts melting. At 15,000 years ago, the Bering Sea Bridge between Alaska and Siberia will allow humans to migrate to America. At 12.9 thousand years ago, the comet impacted the Great Lakes, Michigan, USA, causing the extinction of the mammoth. At 11.4 thousand years ago, the end of Wisconsin glacial period and sea levels went up by 91 meters, or about 300 feet. At 9,000 years ago, metal smelting started. Zooming the timeline really close. At 7,000 years ago, fired clay potting. At 6,000 years ago, simple bows in northern Europe. At 5,000 years ago, crop irrigation in Egypt. At 4.5 thousand years ago, Badarian culture in Egypt. At 4,000 years ago, wheels in Mesopotamia. At 3.5 thousand years ago, bread is developed in Egypt. At 3.2 thousand years ago, hieroglyphic writing is developed. At 3.1 thousand years ago, writing is developed. At 3,000 years ago, Cuneiform writing in Sumer. At 2.7 thousand years ago, Chinese make silk. At 2,500 years ago, the Great Pyramid at Giza is built. At 2.4 thousand years ago, papyrus in Egypt. At 2,000 years ago, Celts begin spreading. Zooming the timeline really closer. At 1.8 thousand years ago, Babylonians now have multiplication tables. At 1.7 thousand years ago, Knossos on Crete destroyed by fire. At 1.6 thousand years ago, water clocks in Egypt. Note that I still love clocks. Like I said, clocks can be normal, specific, etc. At 1,500 years ago, sundials in Egypt. At 1.3 thousand years ago, Hittites first employ iron for weapons. At 1.1 thousand years ago, Mycenae falls to invaders. At 1,000 years ago, Jerusalem becomes Israeli capital. At 900 years ago, Celts spreads from Gaul. At 800 years ago, Corinth founded. At 700 years ago, Biremes developed. At 660 years ago, Byzantium established. At 600 years ago, Greek colony of Poseidonia, or Pastium, Italy. At 550 years ago, first Greek plays. At half a thousand years ago, or 500 years ago, the Persian Empire near its peak. At 400 years ago, Cyprus the Younger dies in battle, and his 10,000 Greek mercenaries fight long route back to the Black Sea. At 300 years ago, the Greek mathematician Euclid active. At 200 years ago, Parisi tribe settle on site of Paris. At 150 years ago, Hipparchus of Rhodes compiles first star catalogue, and Tom Cruise was not in it. At 100 years ago, the Greek grammarian Dionysius Thrax publishes Art of Grammar. Zooming the timeline really closer. At 95 years ago, Armenia begins to expand. At 80 years ago, Sulla smashes Etruscans, then they become Roman civilization. At 60 years ago, Pompey, Crassus, and Jesus Caesar form first Roman Triumvirate. 50 years ago, glass-blowing in Phoenicia. 30 years ago, Mark Antony and Cleopatra commit suicide separately. 20 years ago, Marcus Verrius Flaccus compiles first general dictionary. 12 years ago, Rome begins attempting to grab Germany. 5 years ago, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, also known as BC. All these events in BC are the events before Christ. Now someone else is gonna do it for AD, which is abbreviated Auto Domini. Could someone please do AD? I only did BC.
Ooh, I'll do it.
Okay.